in this building, we'll see it on the inside when we go there, but all of the apartments are heated and cooled through the ventilation air. So it's been exciting to be able to not only learn and start thinking about Passive House, but actually start implementing it and learning and relearning from our own experience. A structural steel framing system with core slab decks.
Okay, so thanks for having us. We're super excited to be here. We've been working on this project in Hamilton for a couple of years now, and it's just such a pleasure to be able to come to Hamilton on a weekly basis. We're total converts. We love the beer. It's amazing. So thanks for being awesome, and thanks for having us. Okay, so we've been asked to talk about a couple things. One is the project, the Ken Soble Tower, which is happening just down the street, but also is kind of the research program and some of our other projects that kind of got us here. And it's been looking for about 10 years now about this issue of housing rehabilitation, maintaining our existing rental stock, and how do we bring it to a high standard, which is going to require a lot of action, a lot of activity, and a lot of money going into these buildings. And we're really thrilled that there's been a sea change in terms of the acknowledgement of this and things happening to make it so that this is coming from an idea to now there's dozens and dozens of buildings where this is happening. But the Ken Soble Tower, with the leadership from Hamilton Housing, is really the first EnerPHit level project that we've been involved in, so we're quite thrilled to see it happen. So just about our practice. So ERA Architects, we do quite a bit of work with existing buildings of all types. The practice area that we lead is really based on affordable housing and older apartment towers, but we do quite a bit of other work. We've been involved in the brickworks and the distillery district in Toronto and that type of thing. But we also have the Centre for Urban Growth and Renewal, which was mentioned, which is really, oh my goodness, this is brilliant. We have a clicker. Okay, thank you. Now I can get my game face on and really do this. And this is our research practice where we actually are able to say, if we aren't able to achieve a project because of the market conditions, how can you do research to then say, what are those challenges in terms of barriers or frictions of approvals or trades or whatever it may be? So we're able to work both in practice and through research and advocacy to kind of push the industry. So it's a great position to be in, and we're very, very busy with both of these sort of personalities. And part of the initiative is called the Tower Renewal Partnership. So we've funded by a series of NGOs and CMHC and others where we're working directly with industry, with resident association groups, with apartment owners, and with really an amazing group of consultants to be able to push the research side that then leads into the practice. So these are the buildings in question. There's a lot of these buildings in Canada. There's a lot of these buildings all over the Toronto area. We're right beside a whole bunch of them here right now. So this is a very kind of ubiquitous vernacular of, let's say, Ontario cities. And they're aging. They're becoming, they've done a really good job as the workhorse of affordable housing in the country, and now they're approaching their 60th birthday and need some love and attention. And the National Housing Strategy is an initiative from the federal government really looking at where are there gaps, especially in affordable housing and in housing rehabilitation. And we were involved with some of this work of establishing small pieces of this. And some of these statistics are really interesting, such as 76% of rental housing was built more than 36 years ago. And really, that's 36 years ago is the youngest generation of purpose-built rental. Most of the stuff is 50, 60 years old. We just haven't built purpose-built housing in a generation, and we have to keep the stuff that we have. And so when we did build, we built very ambitiously. This looks like it's from the Soviet Union or something. But in, throughout the GTA, and across the country, we built massive amounts of large high-rise housing, which really is what makes the region work. It's where affordable housing is. It's where 3 and 4 bedroom rental units are. So they're vital to the workings of it. This is some statistics from StatsCan looking at high-rise buildings across the country. And the way to read this is that in the pie chart, or in these dots, that the navy is the high-rise housing that's apartment rental from our era. The other lighter shades of blue are condo. So you can still see that even though there's been a massive condo boom across the country, more than 50% of our high-rise buildings are still this older rental stock. And a lot of the planning ideas behind them were actually pretty positive, about mixed communities, about affordable housing, about aging in place. And these This is some of the original promotional material. So these were really, sometimes we look at these things with a bit of a bad rap, but this was kind of like the Jetsons had arrived. This was futuristic. Who wouldn't want to live in this awesome place? So very similar to the condos today. This is sort of the vein in which a lot of these were considered. And then the issue is that as they've aged, they've been neglected. So they're older, they're struggling. A lot of the sort of urban issues about where do you go for, where's the nearest cafe, that type of thing have really diminished quality of life. So some of the work that we've been involved in is how urbanistically do you improve these landscapes, but then also in terms of built form. So this slide here at the bottom where you see the chain link fence between buildings where there was a path, they've sort of degraded as they've aged and they've changed ownership. How do we make them a bit better places to live? And so around the world, this isn't starting in the 70s, this is what people did. They said, well, this idea is done, let's tear them down. And I think we're in a position, and a lot of the advocacy that we've done over the years is we just simply can't afford to tear these down. This is housing for over 1 million people in the region, more than 1 million people across the country. We can't aesthetically just say we don't like them, so we're gonna tear them down. How do we make them work? Also economically, it makes way more sense to reinvest in them than it does to tear down and build new. So let's change that paradigm. So Tower Renewal is this initiative where we're saying this is an asset. How do we bring a new life to this, both socially and in terms of the building itself? And there's 3 pillars to this work. One is eco retrofits and deep retrofits we'll talk about today, but also social and economic life and neighborhood transformation in terms of where there's new transit stations coming, how do you build possibly new density, new affordable housing. And so this is sort of the bread and butter of the work we're doing. So how do you improve housing quality while maintaining affordability? That's really challenging. How do you bring new capital to projects without raising rents? That is a challenge. And then the others are sort of following the pieces about more complete communities and tying to transit investment. So you're welcome to look at all these nerdy reports that we do on the website from the nonprofit, looking at things like cooling and comfort in these buildings, looking at financial instruments to be able to support them. How do we understand sort of the ownership structures and some of the planning challenges? So we do quite a bit of work that sort of spreads a lot of different aspects of these buildings and have really great partners. We're quite lucky, especially the federal government and CMHC is taking an interest in some of the work we're doing now is in direct partnership with them, as well as universities and other housing associations, including in New York and elsewhere, which has really helped inform the work. But what we're here to talk about today, which leads to the Ken Soble Tower, is really this issue of housing quality and energy performance. So you've got these aging buildings. How do we look at this as a massive opportunity rather than a massive liability? Where things are now in the typical industry with these buildings is sort of like this slide. If something fails, you fix it. It's sort of like for like. The boiler shuts down, you replace it with a new boiler that's maybe slightly more efficient. The bricks are spalling, you slap on some metal siding and maybe some insulation. But you're not looking at the building holistically. So what we're saying is, as you're doing these investments, as these buildings are aging, how do you bring a comprehensive retrofit that is actually building resilient housing for the 21st century? This recently happened last summer in St. Jamestown. This is the tip of the iceberg of these buildings failing. An electrical system, there's an electrical fire because of a 60-year-old electrical system, which meant that 1,000 people had to be evacuated. Those 1,000 people didn't have a place to go. That was one building. There are 2,000 of these buildings in the region. If we lost 10 buildings, we don't actually have the housing supply to rehouse those people. So we need to begin to think really carefully about how are we keeping these buildings going. We work with a lot of these buildings, it's our bread and butter, and we realize how complicated it is to work in an existing building, looking at the liabilities that they have and the sort of complexities of aging systems, which gets us into the project that we'll sort of dive into. One of the exciting things about the opportunity we've had is we've really connected with international partners. This type of work is happening all over the European Union, especially in Germany after reunification. So the idea of retrofitting older towers is not new. It's actually we're about 20, 30 years behind. So what is the way that we can learn from best practice and bring that over here? These are some of the examples throughout the EU. We were just there a couple weeks ago doing workshops, and this is really looking at where do we want to trend to. So this level of 10% GHG reductions is kind of what the market will support if you just do it through energy savings, is what people are doing, changing to LEDs, etc. We want to get to here or here, and with the Ken Soble Tower, that's where we're able to get to. So what does that holistic retrofit look like? And the other thing is we know that you can actually make an energy efficient building that's actually terrible to live in. If your only metric is carbon reduction, it doesn't actually deal with comfort, ventilation, health, preventing things like mold, preventing things that are crucial. So it's more of a human-centered way of looking at retrofit. after Grenfell, and we were strangely in London when this happened. We were able to meet with officials and fire marshals and people affected. And afterwards, we worked with some colleagues and actually compared the Canadian codes to European codes. And what we found is when you do retrofits, there actually isn't a retrofit code. And when most of these things don't require they're non-extensive building renovations, which means it's really up to the consultant team to say, how do you make sure that this is going to be a good result at the end of it? You're mitigating mold, you're mitigating fire, and these types of things. So pushing for a retrofit code that deals with this is something that we're quite involved in. Another thing that's quite heartening is the Mies van der Rohe Prize is sort of Europe's most prestigious architecture prize, and for 4 years in a row, it's every other year, social housing retrofit of these buildings has won that award, one in the Netherlands, the one that just won in Bordeaux, and it's really great to see this idea is turning about keeping these buildings in real innovation and making sure that they're long-term and resilient. And we're really excited about how, because of previous funding from the provincial government that did lead to dozens of buildings going through retrofits, as well as new funding from the federal government, that we're beginning to see that the social sector and nonprofits, real money is flowing, and there's now dozens and dozens of projects that are looking at more comprehensive retrofits. Some we've been involved in, but some that are much larger than that happening. And which brings us to the Ken and this is looking specifically at some of those funding sources, which brings us to the Ken Soble Tower, which is a project we're thrilled to be involved in. And Yael is the project architect for this one and knows more than I do, so I will pass it over to her.
Great. Hi. So I just checked with Emma, and we're close to our time. 10 minutes. Fantastic. I'm just joking. Okay, so that's perfect. So I'll dive in here, and I'll grab the clicker. Thank you. Okay. Folks here who live in Hamilton are probably familiar with this tower. It's one of the only high-rise towers down by the harbor in the North End. And that is interesting because this is a picture from the year it was built in '67. In '67, this was part of a major master plan that was meant to actually densify through urban renewal with several dozen towers this neighborhood, and this was the only one that was built. There was a big anticipation that everyone would be moving to Hamilton. That didn't happen. It's happening now. But this was that first hope in '67. Today, the Ken Soble Tower is showing its age, and we actually began to speak with City Housing Hamilton about it in 2017. They had looked at it and said, okay, what are our options for this tower? Its infrastructures are failing, it needs some work, and do we tear it down? Do we retrofit it? Do we look at a passive house? And so this was what we came on to do, and we did a sort of deep feasibility study that said, what would it be like to turn this tower into an EnerPHit project? So we were tasked with 4 objectives, and we've kept ourselves, I think, for those of you who are in the building world, setting a project charter at the beginning makes a lot of sense. So, okay, what are our objectives? We had to rehabilitate 146 affordable units. We had to create an ultra-low EnerPHit building. We had to do an asset renewal for 30 years. That is to say, distribution systems and finishes and equipment had to have a 30-year outlook again, and 20% barrier-free units. So we worked with this fantastic team. I don't know if anyone is here today, I don't think so, but have been here in this group, because this is a team who are experts really in multi-unit residential retrofits, and we forged together on this EnerPHit project. We've also worked with Transolar out of Germany, and we brought them on board because we said we need people who have done this before and for whom this is not new. And so that's some of their work in Germany on the left. So this group will know well what it takes to kind of do an EnerPHit project, but I think for us, one of the complexities is what it takes to do an EnerPHit project on a high rise. And so that includes a whole other level of complexity when it comes to systems. And as we've found out, this probably will be one of the biggest EnerPHits in the world once it's complete. There aren't that many actually at this scale. So, obviously fantastic envelope, new distribution systems. We're adding sprinklering to the building. So again, trying to find best practices around life safety for high-rise. And then a modernization that includes new community rooms and spaces and an approach to aging in place. This will be a seniors building when it's complete. So what are the best principles around aging in place that we could put into this building? So I'll just speak really briefly about some of the technical challenges. I think, this group, I've been to several of the sessions, and I think, we could focus another time on what some of those are. We wanted to give you just a brief overview. But from a high-rise perspective, there are sort of three that we flagged for ourselves and that we struggled with throughout the design. One of them is the thermal bridge that balconies represent, right? So every building of this vintage will have balconies, and they will all be radiating heat out into the universe. How do you mitigate that on an existing building? In this case, for a number of reasons, we've actually decided to convert these to Juliets, which are then thermally broken. And that was a sort of operational preference. But we actually did a study that said, what would it look like to wrap them? What would it look like to enclose them in winter gardens, or to, take a number of other options to cut them off and do a thermally broken balcony, for example. So that kind of study, we're hoping to understand how to do that cheaply and efficiently in future buildings. Second one was mitigating overheating. As we all know, heating a passive house is not difficult, but keeping it cool enough to be comfortable, especially with a vulnerable population, is challenging. And so for this, we actually did dynamic thermal comfort modeling against various exposures in the building. We also tasked ourselves with looking at 2050 temperatures, right? Where our region's temperatures can be more like central US, which is alarming. And we said, even in those climates, how do we keep this building cool? And so that kind of study led us to sort of a passive through to active cooling system, where we have a number of factors that people can kick in and stay cool. The third one was modernizing ventilation systems. So this kind of apartment building operates on a kind of ventilation system that we all know does not work, so pressurizing corridors. And relying on undercuts underneath the suite doors. And it's been shown, of course, to provide less than 10% of the fresh air that it's actually delivering to the unit. So what we did here in this case, we looked at a number of decentralized versus centralized options. In this case, added direct ducting directly into units, but reusing a lot of the existing ventilation system. Just one interesting piece of work was how resilient this building could be, and as you'll all know well, in a sort of extreme heat event, is that what the yellow line shows is our building versus blue, which is an OBC building, saying that on a very cold day, if the power were to go out and the systems were to fail, how long the building would be inhabitable. An OBC building is less than a day, and this building ultimately, as modeled, will be more than 5-6 days. Again, this is just part of, there's a major social agenda. Passive House was one of them. Of course, the social agenda was a major part of it. As you'll know well, the West Harbour, the plans for Pier 7 and 8 are well underway, but this project we hope will be kind of a first project in that development that'll say, this project has kept affordable housing in the neighborhood, and we hope can sort of signal a change or a sort of approach to that development. Some of the complexities around making existing units accessible, I think those of you who have tried this before will know well about moving shear walls and getting openings, and so this has been a big challenge and one that we could do a whole lecture about another time. I just want to say briefly, because I'm sure we're running out of time, that in the case of high-rise housing, there are a number of penalties that the Ontario Building Code puts in place, making it very difficult to meet your energy budget. So you'll know that for EnerPHit, we have 25 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year. We estimate that about 5, if not 7 of those are taken up by requirements in the OBC that we are just required to meet. And so in some ways, our budget to start with was much smaller. And so this is something we want to look into more and more and talk to folks here about. How have you managed things like the required block heater on the emergency generator, or some of the issues around garbage chutes, for example? Talking to this group would be great. It's interesting to think in the context of a German-created standard, a lot of our codes are not set up in the same way, and we have a different starting point. And I just want to say, we'll probably end on this, but out of this, we hope there will be, for us anyway, a number of learnings around what we need to do to accelerate the retrofit industry in high-rise housing. This is an example of a business as usual tower retrofit in the UK, which is a pretty standard project, which for us would be quite remarkable. What are the products, best practices, means and methods, and design approaches that make this easy, cheap, and quick to do with residents in place, right? And so we're just about to start a solutions lab funded by CMHC that will look at some of those questions and look at market transformation in our context, both in terms of passive house, but just in terms of deep retrofits in general. Thank you very much.